I'm an associate clinical professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And I think my claim to fame is have developed a method called therapeutic assessment that uses psychological assessment as a brief intervention with clients. We have a Center for Therapeutic Assessment at Austin, Texas. There's one in Milan, Italy, and one in Tokyo, Japan. And there are groups in other places around the world. It's a method that's caught on. And so I spend my time now mainly thinking and talking and doing research and writing and practicing therapeutic assessment.
So I know today isn't going to be focused on therapeutic assessment, but just so as we refer to it, it's such an amazing tool and process. So could you just give us maybe a short synopsis of what therapeutic assessment is?
Yeah, it's a client-centered brief intervention. Clients are referred either by themselves or by another mental health professional. And it turns out it's really good for people with persistent problems in living that they haven't been able to shift in other ways. We start the process by asking people what it is they want to learn about themselves and what questions they have about themselves. And then we choose psychological tests, validated psychological tests that will help give us information that are relevant to their questions. And then we administer those tests. And we work with the client during the testing sessions to look at their own test responses, collaborate with us in interpreting them and discussing them. We have all our scores and our research on what the scores mean, but we really talk with the person about how that fits in their life and how it's relevant to their assessment questions. And then at the end, we review everything the client and we co-construct the answers to their questions. We write it all down in a letter in language that people can understand. And then we give it to them. And then they come back for a follow-up session 8 weeks later and continue to talk about it. And the research shows that the TA can really produce symptom change, and it increases self-esteem and more shame. And that it also helps people if they're doing other treatments. Their therapeutic alliance with subsequent therapists increases, they're more focused on what they want. And so it's like a booster effect for other treatments. And we're still doing research on what it is about TA that works, but it seems that we help clients develop a different core narrative than they come in with, one that is more accurate and coherent and compassionate and useful. And if you can shift that core narrative for clients, then they go out into the world with a different point of view about the world, and then they interact with people and get new information. And so the research shows that the effects of the therapeutic assessment continue to grow after the assessment is done. And relevant to today, I got interested in epistemic trust, which is what we're going to talk about today, because I've come to believe it may be one of the most potent underlying therapeutic principles that we're addressing through therapeutic assessment. And so it explains a lot of research findings about TA that we had trouble. We knew it worked and we knew it worked well, but we had trouble really coming up with as coherent a theory as I would have liked about how that happens. And so when I happened upon this literature on epistemic trust, I got very excited.
I bet when you're doing something that's so impactful and you can feel it, but you're like, why is it? And
right. Yeah. And we even interview clients, like, why do you think this worked? And they tell us what they can.
You emphasize the collaborative nature of it, right? That from the very beginning, that they're the ones developing the questions about themselves. They have an openness to themselves of what do I want to know about myself? And that's where the whole process starts.
It's very different than traditional assessment, of course, where you're often just sent by somebody, you walk in a room, take tests, maybe you get feedback at the end, but you're really not brought along through the process. So.
That's so funny, Stephen, as you even mentioned the initial process, and I had my own visualization of walking in to a traditional therapeutic assessment, which I've done a lot of. I've done a lot of assessments, and I think about it from the client's perspective.
Traditional psychological assessment, right? Yeah.
That you're about to be analyzed, you're about to be looked at, you're about to be dissected, if you will. And even my whole body, as we were talking, I could feel my own anxiety of what that would be like to go, what are they looking for? What's going on? And I always talk about this with couples, to be observed by somebody and analyzed by somebody, it brings out our most anxious, worst selves, don't you think sometimes?
Well, I did research early in my career about how people felt about traditional psychological assessment who had experienced it. And God, it was awful. People
Really?
had really bad experiences, including being told things about themselves that they either didn't think were true or were true, but they weren't ready to hear, and that were told in a shocking or shaming way, or getting some psychological report at the end that they can't even make sense of and combing
Mhm.
through it and nobody to talk to about it. So
Yeah.
that we aspire to be very different from that kind of approach.
Like, I think I might have to go back and listen to our episode on shame because as you were speaking, I'm thinking about some of the different assessments I've done. I used to work for the juvenile justice system, and we
Yeah.
would do really deep assessments on these individuals. And just to think how powerfully difficult that must have been and the way that information was translated. And I'm like, if I only knew then what I know now.
I think psychologists got out of touch with what it's like to be a client in an assessment. We all have some core narrative about ourselves in the world that we've developed that makes
Yeah.
sense of the world and that holds us together. And if somebody's going to try to change that in a short period of time, it's a very emotional process.